Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 3 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading Alan Ryan's On Politics, a history of political theory from the beginning, from the ancient Greeks up until the modern world. We are looking at Plato and Antipolitics today. And I forgot to mention this last week, but we are in person. We were in person last week. I'm home 2 weekends in a row, so these are back to in-person episodes. Unfortunately, going back to Zoom, most likely next week. But just for the sake of our listener knowing that there will be more interruptions this week than there will be next week, most likely.
I would also like to tell our listener that the Amazon Rings of Power is kind of bad, and mostly because it's boring.
Yeah.
I almost fell asleep.
Yeah, it's not very good. I dislike it for other reasons because, I'm all into Tolkien lore and stuff like that, and they have condensed just about 3,500 years of history in the writings
one time period.
into one time period. Yeah.
Well, I'm waiting for some sort of morality.
Yeah.
In it, it's this person's doing this and that person's doing that, but there's no overarching struggle between good and evil.
Yeah. It's just kind of like things are happening.
Yes.
Yeah. Unfortunate.
Just thought I'd mention that.
Yes, but this chapter is, of course, about your favorite philosopher, Plato. We all know how much you love Plato.
I don't not love him. I just think it's just a bunch of we'll talk about it in detail. It's a bunch of utopian nonsense.
Yes, I remember the anti-Plato rants of season 1. So if anybody wants to go back and listen to those are back at the beginning of season 1.
Beginning of season 1.
Yes. So we start off, Alan Ryan talks about the paradoxical Plato. He says, nearly all accounts of the history of political thinking begin with Plato, but Plato's political thought is anti-political. And he goes on to explain that later, but he says the selection here focuses on the Gorgias and the Republic. He says he's critical but not dismissive of Plato. His biggest complaint is that Plato does not take the inescapability of politics seriously. It often amounts to an injunction to abolish the conflicts that politics exists to resolve and fantasies about how it might be done. He says he kind of compares this to Marx's belief or Marx's lack of detail about the politics of a communist society. So both Plato and Marx are interesting in that they, build up this utopian society. Here's what will happen when we resolve all these problems, but they don't really explain how we get there and like what the politics of that actually are.
Correct. It's just theory. It's utopian thought. And it's kind of like a mental exercise, which may be interesting, but doesn't instruct you on what can happen or should happen. Well, I guess he's trying to say what should happen, but it's if it can't happen, what's the point? That was always my complaint.
He goes on to say that Plato's metaphysics have been influential longer than his politics.
True.
His metaphysics have been very influential in Christian thinking particularly. He says the Republic's status was likely acquired during the Victorian obsession with education for young men in public life. He says that the original Greek title of the Republic was politeia, meaning constitution. And this was criticized by Aristotle because it did not focus on the constitution of the state at all.
Right, yeah. Where's the preamble?
Yeah.
Where's the article talks about the king? No, it's just a bunch of theory.
Yeah, he says, but that was not Plato's focus. Plato was rather focused on the ignorance of politicians. That's his main, sort of point throughout these two works. He says, knowledge is the root of salvation. Nothing will go well until kings are philosophers and philosophers are kings. He says that the relationship to Socrates was important here, as they shared a belief that nobody does evil willingly, wickedness is error, it is better to suffer wrong than to do it, and the virtues are one as well as many. So this is like the chief metaphysical, somewhat theological, somewhat moral points that kind of underlie the Republic especially.
Right. And I want to make sure that our listener knows I'm not criticizing this author. He wrote this very well. It's really easy to read, and Plato itself is hard to read.
Yeah.
At least the English translation. Of course, I don't know Greek.
Yeah, I think he almost did a better job than Anthony Kenny did in the history of philosophy that we covered in season 1.
Giving a little bit of historical background to why he was kind of arguing some of the things, or maybe putting it in context so it makes it a little bit more sense.
Yeah.
With regard to the 30 tyrants and the history before these were written, before Socrates was killed by the assembly and all that.
Yes.
So I really enjoyed the chapter. And I think Yeah, I think he's right that where he's talking about that it's more of a description of educational theory as opposed to political theory, because there's really not a whole lot of politics on it. As he calls it, it's anti-politics. But it's a good place to start because it's where everybody else starts and then goes off on their own path, I guess you'd say.
True. And he ends kind of this section about the paradoxical Plato by talking about Socrates for a little bit. He says, many of the most controversial ideas in the Gorgias Republic likely came from Socrates. It was very possible that he himself was very anti-democratic. And I'm going to read this section here on page 35. He says, his friends were aristocrats who felt threatened by democracy, and he may have been executed by the revived democracy, at least partly because he was friendly with members of the oligarchy of the 30 tyrants. Absurdly enough, he had come close to being killed by those very oligarchs. He was ordered to help seize an innocent man whom the oligarchy wanted to murder, but he refused. The point of sending him on an illegal mission was to implicate him in the oligarchy's misdeeds. His refusal was opposition they could hardly have tolerated. He seems to have been saved by the fall of the oligarchy, only to be executed by the regime that had saved him.
Right.
So a little bit like of Socrates also being a little bit of a paradox. He was both saved and killed by democracy, which he hated, or more or less had very negative feelings towards.
Well, they didn't purposely save him. That was just kind of a chance. They purposely killed him.
Yes, that is true.
So I can see how he's still a little, Plato may be a little bit on the side of the aristocracy.
Yes.
As opposed to democracy, because they actually just voted, with premeditated.
Yes, it was. Yes, definitely.
Definitely
purposeful. Alan Ryan then moves on to discuss Plato's life, and he says not much is really known for certain about his life specifically. We know that he was born in 128 BC and died about 80 years later. He was born to an upper-class Athenian family and was related to two of the most violent leaders of the oligarchy in 404 and 403. He said he was repelled by the oligarchy's violence and took no part in politics thereafter. He was actually invited to join them, but he declined after seeing how really awful they were.
I don't know much about that era. Have you read anything about the 30
Not much, no.
I'm going to have to start a book. I start books and then I don't finish them.
Yes.
I'm up to 10 now.
Very
bought
frequently.
Another book yesterday and haven't started it yet.
He then goes on to say that the execution of Socrates in 399 made Plato and Socrates' other followers go into exile. He returned to Athens several years later and founded the Academy in 387. And this was interesting, I didn't know this, but the Academy actually took its name from a wooded grove in Athens. So, like all the words that we have related to academy, academia, all these education words actually come just from the name of a small forest in Athens, which is interesting.
It is interesting.
Yeah. Yes. good thoughts.
I don't know. You don't want me to say
I don't know. I just thought it was a fun
agree.
fact. It's a fun fact.
It is. I don't need to say it. You said it.
I said it, yes.
Keep saying.
All right. He says that Plato was focused on what could be known, not just believed. He thought that definite knowledge had only been achieved in geometry and math, and other forms of knowledge must model themselves on these. He says the Academy was suppressed 916 years later in 529 AD by the Emperor Justinian in a purge of non-Christian ideas. So this little academy that he founded in Athens lasted, over 900 years, which is
wild.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah.
That's just crazy.
Yeah.
So he says that there was this earlier tradition of individual teachers of rhetoric and philosophy who instructed ambitious, politically minded men, and these teachers were called sophists, which literally just means wise men.
Now, weren't you like didn't you hate the sophists? Or was
I
it
think
somebody
so.
else? You were the cynics, I guess you hated. No?
Who did I hate?
I can't remember. Well, we should have kept a list.
We should have. We really should have.
You should always keep a list of the things and people you hate.
Yes, that's good advice.
Don't want to lose sight of your anger and
I
hatred.
think it was the cynics. I think I hated the cynics, the ancient Greek cynics.
Yeah.
I think that's what it was. So Socrates was like a sophist, but he did not teach for success in worldly areas. He instead taught to think of the welfare of the soul, and he also did not charge for his services. So Plato aimed to continue and regularize this work through the academy. That was his main goal here. And at 3 separate times in his life, Plato was tasked with teaching a tyrant to be a philosopher king. Each time went poorly, and Plato escaped with some difficulty. So I think
That's right. You almost killed every time. Because if you're going to teach somebody, at some point you got to tell them they got the answer wrong. I think that's a dangerous proposition when you have an all-powerful tyrant.
It also seems like Plato was not trying to be a people pleaser, coming
Correct.
off of Socrates saying, I'm not going to teach for worldly values. And then probably Plato was saying the same thing to this dude who had everything in the world that he wanted, and
Right.
was not happy. So Plato has left us with his writings, which are artistic, well-written, and fascinating, although there is much debate on the dating of each of his works. They have them like loosely grouped into, early, middle, and late, but even those categories are fluctuating, and we're not sure which works fit into which.
Yeah, they all argue about it just because it's so hard to tell.
Yeah.
How do you determine that? Well, this one sounds like it was written before the other one. This one if it references an earlier work, then you know it's a later work.
Yeah.
But absent that, unless there's a date on it, it's hard to say.
True. Which I'm assuming there were no dates on these. Otherwise, they would have been pretty easy to
You would think so.
to date.
Yes. It's easy to date
It's
something.
easy to say, yeah, it has a date. Yeah.
Brilliant thoughts.
So then we move into the discussion on the Gorgias, which I had never heard of this before. I was a little familiar with the Republic. I mean, we covered that in season 1. I don't think the Gorgias was mentioned at all. But I really liked his discussion here, his summary of the Gorgias. It's a fascinating, seems like a very fascinating book with some great ideas in it.
I believe I've read it.
You believe?
A long time ago. It sounded very familiar.
Yes, I didn't even know it existed.
Yeah. Yeah, several of these, what do you call them? Dialogues.
Dialogues, yes. Plato's famous dialogues.
That's right.
Yes. Which are, of course, written as, if anybody's unaware, they're written as conversations between, characters trying to illustrate his ideas, usually based on real people that he knew. It's probably not likely that these people shared these exact viewpoints, but it was probably based on certain viewpoints that they did have.
Yeah, you can see it like if you were going to write a dialogue, you could use your buddies as characters and have them say stuff.
Yeah, I could exaggerate their own ideas.
Right,
yes,
right.
Yes.
And then make them look like fools.
Yes, exactly.
That's exactly what I do. But yeah, I think I like the summary is well written and all that. But again, it's not, this part I thought was a little unnecessary in the book because he's talking about what's just and right in theory. I didn't know he needed to go into so much detail, but I like Plato's dialogues, the other dialogues, much better than the Republic, because as the summary of the Republic goes, have you had a chance to read it yet?
I haven't read the Republic, no.
Yeah, there's like these long-winded discourses on baloney, and it's like, oh God, can you get back to the conversation?
Yes.
So yeah, it's hard to read. Well, hard to enjoy.
Yeah.
I don't know how hard to read it is. It's hard for me to read anything I don't want to read.
Yes. Hence the 10 unfinished books.
Well, I want to read those. I just get
get distracted by other things you want to read.
I want to read it.
You have very surface level knowledge of the first few years of any historical event, and then past that you don't know anything because you won't read the books all the way through.
I get past the introduction.
That's good.
Nowadays, I'm skipping the preface and introductions. I'm not even going to read it.
Wow.
And then I just go right into the book.
It's probably a good strategy.
Yeah, because I know I'm not going to get through the darn thing. I might as well cut out the chaff at the front.
That's fair.
Anyway, go ahead.
Yes, getting into the Gorgias.
Wasting too much time.
Was probably written around 380, and it was named after the orator Gorgias, who was teaching in Athens. It's split into 3 parts. The character of Socrates interrogates Gorgias about what he teaches young men. He then confronts Gorgias' student Polus, and then has an inconclusive argument with another student, Callicles. So he says that teaching rhetoric was an important and honorable occupation in ancient Greece and Rome. And Socrates began the contrary tradition of belittling rhetoric, and Gorgias kind of represents the rhetoric here. So the dialogue begins with Gorgias presenting himself as a teacher who teaches upper-class men to be successful. And Socrates then forces him to admit that he cannot teach any of the particular arts and crafts that we depend on every day, such as cooking and farming and things like that, which leads to the question of what rhetoric is the knowledge of. He says, we can look at these other crafts and we know exactly what they are knowledge of. What is rhetoric the knowledge of?
The knowledge of the art of persuasion.
Yeah, and that's essentially the conclusion they come to. It turns out to be the art of presenting a case to an audience so that it appears to them as you want it to appear, no matter its intrinsic merits or lack thereof.
I don't know if I agree with that, but maybe it is. I mean, I think the idea behind rhetoric is that you can organize your thoughts and articulate a point of view so that the audience can understand it. And the cynical version of it is so that the audience will believe whatever you say, no matter how truthful or how much of a lie it is.
Yeah.
But maybe back then that's what rhetoric was. But I kind of view it as similar to trial advocacy training. You know, how to articulate an argument so that, you know, on one side you'd say, well, I just want them to believe it. Well, if you believe in the argument yourself, really what you're studying is how to best present it.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, it seems like, you know, I mean, we'll get into this a little bit later, but it seems like the arguments that Socrates is leveling against it makes it seem like rhetoric is closer to like what we would just call like a political speech now. It's just one person, you know, essentially saying, you know, this is what is right and, you know, ignore the other side, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, a lot of the rhetoric, that's what it was. It was political speech. But I mean, I would hope that you'd have at least a little bit better character than just to be trying to lie like Joe Biden does every time he opens his mouth.
Exactly. That is the rhetorician that is Gorgias here, I guess, that we would kind of see that as.
I would not equate the two.
That's fair. So he says
one is just a very poor, imbecile liar.
Yes.
And the other one is Gorgias.
Yes, that's fantastic. So Socrates says that rhetoric is exactly the reverse of philosophy. And philosophy, of course, is to understand things as they really are, no matter how they may appear. So Socrates says rhetoric is not a skill at all. It serves no useful purpose and achieves nothing that assists human existence. It shows what is wrong with democratic politics and politicians, and that flattery and deceit drive out the truth. So he's really saying it's essentially a bunch of lies is what rhetoric is.
Right.
He says the successes of Gorgias' students are bad for them and their city. They promote injustice by making the worse appear better. So the target of Socrates' attack is the Greek view that unbridled self-interest constitutes success. The only thing worth having is a just soul, in Socrates' opinion. He says here, I'm going to read from the book, to bring about the death of your enemies and the confiscation of their property by unjust means is not success, but inner death. A man who had behaved like that and knew his real intentions would wish to be punished for his crimes, not to get away with them. Unsurprisingly, this meets with entire disbelief from Gorgias' student Polus, who laughs at Socrates and points out that he will not find anyone to agree with him. Socrates points out that neither mockery nor majority opinion are good guides to the truth, and he asks Polus to show him the error of his ways by arguments. That kind of brings about the second point. But what do you think of this overall, like, first section where he's talking to just Gorgias?
Well, it's clear why Christian thinkers love these arguments, why they study Plato and they have, you know, the Platonic ideal, because you talk about, you know, even if you're powerful, it's not just that you can do what you want. It's what you should only do what is right. And even if you have the power and you're not punished on this earth, apparent to everybody else, you're still a poor soul, and you are better, or you are worse off because of it. And that's what his argument is. That there's a certain morality and a certain character that if you don't possess that, you are a lesser person, no matter how powerful or how happy you seem to be on the outside or to others. And I think it's a great discussion.
Yeah, it's like, you know, you have all this natural success, but are you really successful at all if it's all kind of founded on lies? I mean, that's really what Socrates or Plato is coming from here.
Lies are just brute force, too. Yeah, and that was revolutionary at the time.
And I really like the point at the end that, you know, majority opinion and mockery are not, you know, good guides for morality.
Right.
You can't just mock me and expect me to be like, oh, you're right, my morals are wrong. You can't just say, well, these people don't agree with you. It's like, well, I'm still correct here. Those are still the right morals to have.
And it's similar to the online mobs you see nowadays. You know, there it was in person. You know, it was probably much more difficult to be an outcast, you know, in that society, because it's smaller and it's all in person. The mockery's to your face.
Yeah.
Or you know, to your friends behind your back, but it's actually said, not just typed on some screen. And even today, it feels powerful, you know, the mockery and all that kind of stuff. But he's right; it doesn't make any difference.
True.
You know, to your morality, your self-worth, you just have to remind yourself of that.
So then Polus then brings up an interesting point. He defends earthly success very vehemently. He says it's natural for people to be unrestrained in gratifying their urges. So Socrates thought that those with worldly power had no real power. Their ambitions were a form of sickness of the soul. Gorgias and Polus lack power over themselves, as they cannot pursue the good life that they don't understand. He says we must try to teach justice. And here he defines justice as being good for its possessor, no matter what happens to him. So I kind of like, do you agree that it's like natural for us, like if we were, just kind of left freely, that we would just, go out and satisfy our own urges? Is that like the natural form for humanity?
Are you asking me?
Yes, I am asking you.
Not necessarily. I don't. I mean, if you were not part of a society to begin with, I don't know. I don't know what the true natural state of humanity is.
Yeah.
Because I grew up in a society. But that's the big argument between the two is, and I think they kind of talk around each other about this issue because Socrates is talking about the ideal, and Gorgias is talking about the practical reality of the situation, and it's an argument that is happening today, and it's been happening continuously. I'm sure before Plato wrote it down, and still today about, okay, what's the nature of man? Are we naturally good people, or are we naturally evil people? We need rules or society to keep us in check. Our own self-restraint is really what Socrates is saying. You need to educate yourself as to what is true, what is in existence, and what is also good. And if you aren't knowledgeable about that, and you don't act on that properly, then you are hurting yourself, and you will know it. I guess.
Yeah. I feel like the character of Socrates here would agree, like, to an extent with Polus, that it is like our natural tendency to want to, satisfy our urges, but, real power comes in overcoming that,
right?
And looking for justice. And he says, justice is good no matter what. And that's what brings us into the next section.
Right. I said Gorgias, it was Polus at this point.
Yes, Polus, yes, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Oh, did you say?
I said Gorgias.
Oh, you said Gorgias. Oh, you should be sorry.
Yes.
So then Callicles enters, and he defends the view that a good man who suffers misfortune is worse off than a wicked man who gets away with his crimes. He says, that wicked man will be more successful even if he doesn't have justice. So he also defends the idea that the good life consists of gratifying our impulses, whatever they may be, with no regard for others' interests. And I'm going to read from the book here. I thought there was an interesting point about, Homeric heroes and stuff like that. He says, the gods of the Iliad do it, and everyone would like to live like a god. That view itself has two different interpretations. One is that the good life for the individual is an immoral, or at least an amoral and non-just life. The other, the counterintuitive view that justice according to nature is whatever one can get away with. That was what the Athenians told the Melians. Plato was committed to the doctrine that nature is on the side of justice as we ordinarily understand it. Indeed, that the cosmos is itself made orderly by justice. So it's this interesting idea that, like, we have a natural, tendency to do whatever is in our power. And because, that whatever is in our power, is innate to us, then that must be like our just life. That is what is right for us because we can do those things. That's kind of Callicles' thought here, which is an interesting idea. But I mean, it's of course one that, most Christian thinkers wouldn't agree with,
no true Christian thinker would agree with, but a lot of people agree with that. I mean, it's a might makes right, essentially, is the argument. And it has this, in that you are, basically you're given that power by God, so you might as well wield it. Yeah. If you're put in a position of power, use it. Yeah. And
it's interesting to kind of hear this about, the Iliad and stuff, because I'm reading the Iliad in my Greek lit class, and it's like all of the gods are awful. Yeah, why would we write gods, to be this terrible and stuff? But it makes more sense if we're looking at it from like, if the Greek people really do believe that, whatever's in my power is the right thing for me to do, then it would make sense to extend that to the gods. Of course, the gods would do anything that is in their power because that is the right thing to do. They are able to do whatever, and so that is right.
True. Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, when I read those stories, I don't really want to be a Greek god. But I guess it would be much better than what the Greeks had at the time. Yeah. Because you'd have a certain amount of power and you wouldn't have to worry about starving to death. Yeah. or working 16-hour days in the fields. So I guess I probably would.
Yes, probably.
God, with all their faults and such, conflicts.
So Socrates then agrees with Callicles that the philosopher would be a terrible politician amidst the well-spoken rhetoricians. But that is not the point. It is being just for its own sake in the here and now that the wise man is committed to. So he goes on to say that Plato believed that few politicians would fare well in the judgment of the afterlife But Socrates doesn't even look at the afterlife here. He says it still defends that the just man does better now, even without considering, eternal punishment and things like that. The just man in the here and now is still better than the unjust man.
Yeah, the eternal punishment makes it a lot easier to argue for a just life, a moral life, than without. Like an atheist has a hard time arguing about doing the right thing that hurts you, or doesn't help you at least, because what's the point?
Yeah.
And if you don't have a soul, what are you doing it for? Well, you're doing it for, intellectually, it's the right thing to do. Well, why is that right?
Yeah.
And it's really hard to make that argument without the afterlife. The afterlife is, hey, there's a judgment, and this is the morally wrong thing to do. And so I'll be rewarded if I don't do the morally wrong thing, and you will be punished later.
And it's interesting that Plato makes Socrates here, make the argument harder for himself, because he says, Plato did believe in that sort of afterlife, but he's making the character of Socrates have a harder argument by saying, the just man is still better now. It doesn't even matter about the afterwards. He's still better now.
Yeah, and I wonder, of course, nobody would know except for the unjust person whether it would be better or worse. But I've met a lot of people that are just mean, angry people, and they suffer. They may be very wealthy. But if you meet people that are just kind of lying jerks, they are miserable generally. Now, whether they were miserable and that causes them to be lying jerks, or being lying jerks cause them to be miserable, or a combination of both, I don't know. But there's some truth to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Callicles then states that satisfaction is good and dissatisfaction is bad, and that's kind of his measure for everything here,
right?
Which is key to Socrates' argument. He says the more insatiable our appetites, the greater our dissatisfaction. He kind of compares it to trying to fill an infinite number of leaky barrels. If we just want everything, then we're going to be dissatisfied more often. If that's bad, if that's what we're striving to move away from is dissatisfaction, then we should not want everything, and we should not try to have all of these earthly desires, because it'll just lead to more dissatisfaction.
It's funny. I just watched a short video. I don't know who the gentleman was. He's an older gentleman. And he was talking to a forum, and he says, greed is not what is moving people, what is motivating people in today's world, or maybe ever. It's envy, because this guy was old enough to have lived in the Great Depression. He says, that we had a tremendous lack of resources, and it was terribly hard and difficult. But any one of us can walk in the middle of the night, in the downtown street. But now, nobody, even though the wealth is 6 times greater than it was then, people are unhappy because they see some other people have even more. Yeah. And it's kind of like the same thing that Socrates is talking about. It's this insatiable desire for more and more and more. And so somebody who has more may be unhappy, even unhappier, because they don't have more than that. Once you have more, you want more. And so, it's an infinite well of desire.
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of a weird way of looking at it, which may be true. I don't know. What do you think?
I do think there is some truth to that. That it's not so much that I need enough; it's that I need what you have and more. Essentially, it's not like I just need to survive. I need what's due to me. But I just need even more than that. I have it's like a lot of people have a very over-exaggerated view of what's due to them. I struggled at this one point in the past, so now you all have to give me something to help me now in the future. Right. And it's a strange concept. When it's framed like that, I don't get it.
Yeah. I've also been of the theory for a long time that generally poorer people tend to be more generous of spirit than wealthy people. Not always, but I've noticed that. If you go up to somebody who appears to be wealthy and say, "I'm down on my luck, I need $10," you're not as likely to get it if you go up to somebody who looks like they're struggling. I think I tend to think it's because they know the struggle and they've been there. Yeah. They've needed $10, and maybe if they have $10 and they can spare it, they'll give it to you. That's been my general thought. It's kind of the similar thought here is that if you have your stuff, you just want more.
Yeah. True.
Kind of an aside thought, I guess.
Interesting point. So he ends this discussion on the Gorgias with Socrates insisting that he is the only true statesman. He says, so far from being entitled to the lion's share, the true statesman serves for nothing. But the true statesman does not expect to persuade an Athenian jury that reducing young men to baffled incomprehension is a public service. In which case, says Socrates, he will content himself with the thought that an innocent man who is persecuted by villains dies with cleaner hands than theirs. So kind of going back to that original idea that, these rhetoricians are really just lying. They're just spreading, injustice by covering up what's true and good. And what's true and good is really, having that justice, having that sense of,
And it's kind of a commentary on the death of Socrates, too.
Yes, true. Very true. So then,
although he did a very good job, the author did, of describing the context of the trial of Socrates and really explained the verdict better than I've ever read it explained before. Where I'm almost sympathetic with the jury.
Really?
Yeah. Because he was certainly breaking the law, as it was. As far as blasphemy, I guess really was what it was against their gods, and he all but admitted it. And then when they would have expected somebody to say, "Oh, I'm not going to do it anymore," and that way they get off with it, with whatever their crime was. He said, "I'm going to keep doing it, and I'm going to be out there tomorrow.
If you
quit me, I'm going to keep doing it." and then you have no other option but to kill me.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what else are they supposed to do?
I guess, that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, he completely thumbed his nose at the court, as such as it was, and challenged them. Basically challenged them to follow their own law.
Huh.
And which is a ballsy thing to do. So it's you kind of have more respect for Socrates, but I actually have a little more respect for the jury. It's like, okay, you want it?
All right,
here it comes, good and hard. Anywho, on to the Republic.
Yes, so Alan Ryan then moves on to the Republic, which takes up, I think, the majority of this chapter here, because of course
it's more definitely specific to what is the perfect society, perfect government.
Yes.
In a perfect society. And of course, the philosophers are in charge because philosophers always think the philosophers should be in charge.
Of course. Yes, and it's of course centered around justice as well. That's also one of the big themes here.
Right.
So the Republic looks at the natures of a just society and just social order. Plato was looking for the rule of the righteous who can ensure that the polity as a whole practices justice and displays the qualities that the soul of the just displays. So he's really looking for it's almost like a theological world, essentially.
Right.
It's like, it has to reflect, the just soul. That should be what the perfect society is based on. So the Republic is a conversation between Socrates, Plato's brothers Glaucon and Adiamantes, Polemarchus, the son of the good old man Cephalus, and the wild man Thrasymachus, a little-known sophist. So the discussion starts with Cephalus stating that a good character is our best possession, rich or poor, which prompts the discussion of the value of wealth. So Cephalus says his wealth means he need never cheat or steal, and he can die knowing that he never lied and pay his debts. So justice is here defined in like the classical way of harm nobody, live honestly, and give everyone his dues. So Cephalus,
which is a pretty good, rule of thumb. I mean, I think a lot of people live by that now.
I think that's a good way to live by. Yes. I mean, if nothing else.
Right.
So Socrates brings up situations where we shouldn't give what is due. One of the examples is you lend your neighbor, or your neighbor lends you a knife, and then your neighbor goes crazy and he's going to kill somebody. Do you give him his knife back? Technically, it's due to him, but is it just? Is it correct to give him his knife back?
I think Kant would say, yeah, it's his knife.
Yeah, probably.
There you go.
There you go. It's yours. Do whatever.
I think first you should restrain him and then give him his knife back. Yes. Here's your knife.
Probably. And so Cephalus then passes the definition to his son Polemarchus, who says justice is giving every man his due. So justice is here defined as doing good to our friends and harm to our enemies. So it depends on who we're dealing with, essentially, on what is just.
It's really the only effective foreign policy. No better friend, no worse enemy.
Interesting.
Have you heard that before?
I've never heard that exact quote, but I've heard the
famous phrase of what American foreign policy should be. No greater friend, no worse enemy.
Interesting.
And it's like a real politic, I guess you say. There's no morality in foreign policy.
I've never really thought of that.
Yeah.
So Socrates says it is wrong to injure anyone or make them worse than they are. And he brings up an interesting point here in that we can punish people who do wrong because punishment does not harm the people it is justly imposed upon because it does not make them worse. It is their due, which is an interesting concept. Like if I'm a bad person, punishment really shouldn't harm me because it's what I deserve. Right? It's not harming my character any more than I have already harmed it, and it will actually help me improve my character.
Right. Yeah, I think Socrates goes on to say that if you punish somebody, you're doing them a good because of that, the reform element, which I tend to ascribe to a certain degree. I mean, there are limits to punishment.
Yes.
It's not torture.
Yes.
But it's the same theory of Augustine and I think Thomas Aquinas about the death penalty is that it allows them to focus on their misdeeds before they're.
Yeah. It's also kind of the opposite of what I've heard. I think I mentioned this a couple episodes ago about like how tolerance isn't necessarily a good thing.
Right.
Like we see it as a good thing. It's doing good to our friends. But if we tolerate, bad opinions and bad morality, then is that really doing them any good at all? If it's just reinforcing their bad moral viewpoint.
Well, tolerate it.
Yes.
Or celebrate it.
Celebrate, I guess, is
because
probably closer.
because that's tolerance nowadays means celebration.
Yes.
If you're tolerant, it's like if somebody says, well, maybe I won't go into the more controversial subjects, but like I'm a crazy person, and tolerance would be just ignoring that person. Okay, they want to be crazy, it's their business. Tolerance nowadays is right on, you go, girl. That type of thing. Anyway, that's an aside.
Yes.
Where were we at?
So we are just about where Thrasymachus enters. So we finished up with Cephalus and Polemarchus. So Thrasymachus enters, saying that making moral judgments is nonsense. The intelligent man acts to suit himself. We are required to act in self-aggrandizing behavior. And so justice then is whatever is in the interest of the stronger. So going back to Callicles' argument of the Gorgias, which is an interesting idea once more. I wanted to read from the book here. So Thrasymachus' argument is interesting. He says that he begins by pointing out that once we know the form of government of a Greek city, we can work out in whose interest legislation will be framed. It will favor the poor in a democracy and the tyrant in a tyranny, and so on. That is the claim that people define justice to suit themselves. He's then tripped up by a patently unfair argument. Socrates gets him to agree first that subjects are obliged to obey their rulers, which is to say that they behave justly in doing so. He next gets him to agree that rulers sometimes make mistakes about their interests. Putting the two premises together yields the conclusion that it is sometimes just for subjects to do what is not in the interests of the stronger. In other words, it is just not to be just, which is simply incoherent. Which is an interesting counter to that idea, because Thrasymachus' idea is essentially like, well, the government would do what's best because, the government, has control over these things. They have the power, so whatever is just is defined by them.
Yeah, he's not saying they would do the best. They would do what is right.
Yes.
I guess it's different because what is correct may
according
not be
to their setup, essentially,
correct.
Which goes back to, well, if I have power in my soul, then I could just use that power because that is correct to me. Right. Essentially that idea. But then Socrates does make a good point against that. So then Socrates then says, just as medicine promotes the health of the patient, not the doctor, so too should justice promote the welfare of the subjects, not the ruler, which I thought was an interesting way to frame that as well. Any other occupation is not about serving yourself. It's about serving, the people around you. Even if you look at, the basic trades, somebody who makes clothes isn't always making clothes for themselves. They're making it for their customers, the people who need them.
Yeah, that's why all the politicians lie and call themselves public servants. Because they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be public servants. When they go to Washington, D.C., they're supposed to serve the public. It's supposed to be a burden. It is not.
Yes.
It is a reward, and they do not serve us. They serve themselves.
Yes.
And their friends.
Yeah, so it's an interesting idea because they're both looking at justice, but Socrates is bringing up, if justice is like essentially the good that people are giving, then it shouldn't, be dependent on whatever the tyrant or the ruler is. Right. It should be, given to the people, essentially.
Yeah, it's an argument over the premise of what justice is.
Yes, exactly. Right. So Thrasymachus then falls back to justice being the value that leads men to keep promises, tell the truth, do their duty, and obey the law. But doing justice is for idiots, is his next argument here. He says, the unjust man will always get the better of the just man. Justice is what is in the interests of the stronger. It is the view that if justice is at odds with self-interests, it is not a virtue. Injustice is a virtue, and justice a vice. This would not have struck Plato's readers as oddly as it strikes us. The Greek conception of ethics was not ours. The good life must benefit the individual who leads it, which is why Socrates has to argue that the good man is happy no matter what.
Yeah, and if you think back to that time, if things are going poorly for you, it was viewed as a moral failure. You must have done something wrong, or you've been a bad person. That's why your crops failed, or that you're poor, or bad things happened to you. Like the gods must be unhappy with you. And so it was a more common view that success is a result of a just life or a good life, as opposed to maybe acted untoward or whatever the case may be.
Essentially, going back to that idea that if you have innate power, you should be seizing it. That is just for you to do, which is a fascinating idea, but it doesn't necessarily hold up, in my opinion.
Why not?
I mean, I guess it depends on how you define justice, but I think if everybody's doing, what is in their own self-interests, then you're going to have a lot of conflict because self-interests, cross paths with each other.
Correct.
So Socrates then says that justice is in the interest of both individuals and the community. And so a community where everyone respects everyone else's rights will be more prosperous than one where everyone tries to cheat and steal, kind of what I just said. We have to respect others' rights. And so this raises the question of how we ensure everyone acts justly. So, if we're in this society where everyone should be acting justly, do we have to have somebody, go around and inspect the justness of everybody? And then who inspects the inspectors is the next argument there.
That's always how they get you.
And he kind of ends this section by saying, that question is still unresolved. Socrates doesn't answer that, and Thrasymachus doesn't answer that. It's still left up in the air to today.
Yeah, what you have is additional inspectors that inspect the inspectors who inspect us. And then you have inspectors that inspect the inspectors who inspect the inspectors who inspect us.
Is there one more step to that?
Yeah, Civil War. And then anarchy.
Yes, of course.
And then a tyrant.
Naturally. So then we go into the next section, which is the argument after Thrasymachus. So Thrasymachus is kind of routed by this idea that justice should be in the community, essentially. And so then Glaucon joins by posing the crucial question: is it always in the interests of the individual to be just? Because this is still Socrates' point, that the just man will do better. But Glaucon is like, well, will he really? He says, Glaucon says we are selfish creatures who prefer our own welfare. He says morality is a form of insurance that we have kind of created. Don't do as we would not be done by, kind of a reverse golden rule. Don't hurt others because they'll hurt you back. That's why we have morality. He says, if we were immune to punishment, we would do well to behave badly. Morality is an artificial human invention, but an important invention that politics, government, and law depend on. And Alan Ryan brings up a good point here. It's very similar to kind of the evolutionary idea of morality, is that, it makes sense for us to evolve a sense of morality because that protects each other, essentially.
It's like the societal development theory. We develop societies because if we didn't, we wouldn't have survived, or the more prosperous people that were more apt or more inclined to be agreeable and cooperative had more children over that type of thing.
So Plato held that morality was inscribed in the natural order. So
I think that's his main flaw, because he believes in this natural order of morality, and that's what leads him to his utopian theories.
That's exactly what it does. Right? Because the character of Socrates then describes a polis divided by labor, and so justice is then defined ultimately here as sticking to one's last, as everyone essentially does what he is best at. It's a similar argument to what's sort of the power that's in our nature, in a way, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And the Republic then turns to education, and sort of describing the perfect city. So then we move into the next.
And he's so light on the details. How does this even happen?
Yeah,
but we'll get to that.
Yes. In this section, it's the guardians and their education, and Plato goes on to describe Callipolis, the beautiful city in which the citizens specialize in what they are best suited to do. So he says that the first step in creating this utopian society is to expel all poets and artists, for he wanted to instill courage in regard for truth, which is an interesting first step there.
Yes, especially for a guy like Plato, who was a writer and involved in the arts.
It kind of goes back to his argument against rhetoricians, and I say that here, but it's based on the theory that true knowledge is knowledge of the forms, the unchanging true essences that make things what they are. And so art is therefore a double misrepresentation, as it paints deceitful pictures of what is already a deceitful picture.
And, in today's society, would that be such a bad thing? I mean, who are considered our artists? I guess movies and TVs. I mean, painters, I guess there are painters out there, but nobody pays attention to them anymore.
Yeah, really.
Sculptors, they make weird stuff and put them in our public parks, and we're like, what is that?
Yeah.
That's beauty. That's anger. That's a wall. It's a rectangular metal wall. Well, there was I think they finally tore it down. The Sarah sculpture. It's a famous artist. It's before your time, literally. They had this Sarah. I think his name was Sera. Anyway, famous artist, and he had the Sarah sculpture downtown St. Louis, which is really just a metallic wall. I don't know what it was supposed to represent, but it went and in this square, the public park downtown off of Market Street, if I remember correctly. And it went on for some distance and turned this way and that way. And it became a urinal for the homeless people. I mean, it was horrible. It was horrible because they, it's a wall behind. They could shelter themselves and all that kind of stuff. And so there's arguments for years about what to do about the Sarahs. Well, the art community is like, well, it's a famous art thing. And everybody's like, well, it's a urinal and the graffiti we have to clean off of it every day and stuff. And it was just, why didn't you do like a sculpture of someone or something, or plant a tree or something?
I actually made a note here in regard to, kicking out all the poets and the artists because they are misrepresentations. I thought it was interesting to compare that to Joseph Campbell of last season, because he was very strongly in the opposite opinion, that poets and artists give the truest representations of the truth. And I just thought that was an interesting kind of divide between the two. It is
interesting. Yeah.
Very, very opposite ends of the spectrum there.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So he then goes on to say that the ruling class should be highly educated, and both men and women should be highly educated. And he kind of draws on Spartan ideals there, which were more equal in terms of, the education that men and women received. So he said that education begins by introducing virtue through tightly constrained syllabus of poetry and drama. Because Plato wasn't necessarily against poetry and drama at all, so long as it introduced the right virtues and the right values. So you have to kick out all the old artists who had the wrong values and instill the new artists who have the right values.
Correct. Which is always what you should do.
Yes. It's a rule to live by. If people are saying the wrong things, kick them out and put in new ones that say the right things. So after the syllabus of poetry and drama, then there would be training in gymnastics and warfare. And then this culminates with the most apt receiving philosophical training that will enable them to rule wisely and justly. So an interesting system of education, starting with the arts and then moving into, the physical things and then finally into the more abstract, philosophical concepts. It's very different from our education system, but it'd be curious to see, just how well that would work out for people, actually raised in that system.
We should open a charter school and get a bunch of poor people to go to it, and we'll see how it turns out.
We are not doing a psychological experiment on poor people.
Well, if we get consent,
I guess so.
I'll tell you what. We could the two of us could administer a charter school that will educate better than what. Well, let's just say conservatively 50% of the public schools in this country. How about that? Don't you agree?
I would agree.
We could have, and we could start with art and poetry. We can go into gymnastics, mathematics, geometry, and then we end up in philosophy, like in 8th grade. And I bet you our kids would test higher than anybody else in the country.
That's probably not a bad point.
I mean, really.
That's kind of sad.
It's less a commentary on our ability than the
other
actual
people's
performance
ability.
of our public school system.
Exactly.
In some areas, not all of them. I know there's devoted teachers. Don't attack me.
So the
teachers are the worst.
I know. You've told me about this.
I'm just joking. That's a complete joke.
Sure. So this whole
fireman.
We are not getting into your irritation of firemen. Oh man.
And today's 9/11. I just blasphemed the firemen
on 9/11. Good job.
Because every fat fireman across the country is going 9/11. We're heroes.
All right. So, back to Plato. This whole society would be based on the golden lie. Citizens will be taught that one is born with a bronze, silver, or golden soul.
I need to say, I'm sorry, that the guys at 9/11 were heroes.
Yes.
I'm just commenting on all of the other firefighters that are glomming upon the heroic acts of all the firefighters that bravely went to the towers to rescue people selflessly and with great character, and I have utmost respect for them. I'm criticizing the people that didn't do anything,
Yes.
but are trying to attach themselves to those heroic acts. That's all.
Yes. Thank you for the clarification.
Our listener was upset with me for a minute.
Yes, I'm sure. So these different types of souls, the bronze souls would be workers, the silver are soldiers, and the golden are guardians or philosopher kings.
I don't think he ever figures out how to determine that. I mean, there's no test or anything.
He says, essentially, I mean, it's essentially the same thing that Marx says, but the only thing he says, at least here, is that it's a meritocratic system where the elite breed elite children. He says, well, there'd be, calculations to determine, how to breed the best children, I guess, which is little eugenicist, but
and it never works.
Yeah,
and yeah.
But he does say that the elite are not conditioning the people because the lie is golden because it contains a hard truth. There's a cosmic symmetry between the order of the ideal society and the order of nature. We are naturally suited to different roles. So it's not conditioning. It's because my wacko metaphysical ideas are really true. It's not just telling them a lie.
I think there's some truth that there are different people have different aptitudes.
Yes, I agree.
And I think that people are most happy when they're able to pursue what they're capable of and what they're interested in. When there's an overlap of that and they can find it and they can do it, I think that there really is a true happiness and satisfaction there. The hard part is you can't set up a governmental structure that's going to feed people into one way or the other, except for a governmental structure that allows people enough choice and enough resources to be able to find their aptitude and their interest and to pursue it.
Yeah.
So it's like the reverse of what he's doing. He's saying you're going to be put in this category and you're going to do X and you're going to be happy doing it because that's all you can do, as opposed to letting everybody sort themselves out as far as their ability and their willingness to do different things. But anyway, my little commentary there.
Exactly. So it says we can be happy and fulfilled when we occupy a social position that reflects our innate character. Essentially, says,
I think there's some truth.
There is some truth to that,
but how do you?
The issue is, grouping all these people into only 3 separate classes and saying you're going to be happy in this one individual class. You can't do anything about it.
Yeah, and so are your kids.
Yes.
And you can see, people that, like, I think all 4 of my boys are smarter than me, which I never would have wanted to admit before, but and you're like, yeah. but so I would be in a different category than my kids. Now, some people have dumb kids that are really smart, and I think they struggle with it. I would struggle with it. I think I would really struggle if I had dumb kids. Because I don't care if they're athletes or not. I don't really bother me like when Sam can beat me in basketball.
Yeah.
But when he was able to do stuff intellectually better than me, I'm like, this is ridiculous. You can do higher math than me. What the hell is going on here? So that was hard. Yes. Gets harder with each of you.
Yeah. So I'm going to read this last paragraph from this section, which is kind of a very critical look at this whole idea. He says that Plato's case could be made differently. It could be argued as a flatly sociological proposition that a polis, or a modern state, functions best when there's a clear class structure with powerless workers, a military caste that knows its business, and an educated governing class whose right to rule is taken for granted. It would not be impossible to present modern China as evidence in favor of the thought. This is a sociological claim that needs no philosophical backing beyond the empirical evidence. If it is true at all, it is a truth of social science. Conversely, such a perfectly structured society can be presented as a dystopia rather than a utopia, something to avoid at all costs. In Brave New World, Aldous Huxley created just that.
So did China.
Yeah,
China
exactly.
is a dystopia, man. I mean, that is a horrible, horrible system. But I think his point is correct.
Yes.
His point is right, that it's really a sociological issue as opposed to a political discussion as to what people can do, but whether you can force them to into certain character categories and have them be happy doing it. In China's that actually aggravated me that he mentioned it, but I guess he's not saying it with approval.
Yes.
But because China's not set up in a system where the best in certain areas get certain opportunities, there's a political superstructure over all that with the communist party on top of it, and then all the graft and et cetera associated with that system.
Yes.
Anyway.
So then we finally get essentially Plato's definition of justice. So what is justice? We've been talking about it this whole time. So he sets up this virtue system. So temperance is the virtue of the workers, for they look after essentially the earthly aspect of everything. So they need that self-control, that temperance. Courage is the virtue of the soldiers, and wisdom is the virtue of the guardians. And then justice is the overarching virtue that governs the whole. So essentially, justice is the combination of all of them. It looks over all of them. It's essentially, what is... It's like the personification almost of the whole system.
Right. He views it justice as either for the system has a just system or it doesn't. It's not like he's saying that individuals aren't just.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we get into here. I'll say that in just a little bit. But he says, rulers here are not aristocrats. They have no property, no children. Their interests are subservient to the interests of the whole.
It'll last 1 week.
Yeah. He says, their happiness is less significant than the happiness of societies, and they will be happy because they are fulfilling their natures. He says that's the argument that he makes throughout all of this.
That ends after the first day.
You went from a week to a day.
No, their happiness ends in a day. The change comes in a week. That's when they start asserting their happiness. Come here, you.
And so this is where we kind of bring it back to the beginning with essentially the unpolitical nature of everything. This is a very
anti-political.
Yes. This is an anti-political justice. Law does not exist in the republic. For once this philosopher king's rule, the conflicts that law regulates would just vanish.
Yeah.
Which is,
it's a utopia.
It's a utopia. So we don't need any laws.
Right.
And he says there is no place for the idea of conflicting but legitimate interests. So that the task of the rulers is to know what the correct allocation of tasks and rewards is and to institute it. So there's no varying opinion, there's no conflicts. It's just everybody agrees that this is right, and so there's no need for politics. There'll be no discussions on what is different and things like that.
Yes,
which
is very
is
very similar to Star Trek, like with no money.
Yeah.
And like how do they get people motivated for this? But they kind of expound on it where you get better assignments, I guess. But at some point they do.
It kind of reminds me. I think this was episode 1 of this season, but we've kind of mentioned the reason the Athenians were able to look at different governments was because they knew about different governments, and this is very much. I feel like kind of saying, everybody would be happy in this government because they wouldn't know anything else existed. They wouldn't have those conflicting discussions because everybody wants the correct, best thing according to the system.
Yeah, for themselves and for society, and they know they're cogs in a wheel. It's very, very. His comparisons to Marx theory is pretty apt, But it's just a bunch of wishful thinking.
Yeah.
There's no facts based upon this, and it would never work. And that's always my criticism of Plato's thoughts.
Yeah. So then we move into the last thoughts, which are sort of the big problems with this, as Alan Ryan sees it. He says that the crucial task of politics is to align the social, economic, and political order with the divinely appointed natural order, in Plato's opinion. So there must be a central role for he who understands that order. And so that's kind of the reasoning that the philosophers must be king. If we have this divine order, then those who understand that order have to be in charge.
And like some of the biggest mass murderers were philosophers, by the way.
And so Alan Ryan brings up this point then, would such an enlightened person be willing to return to the world of illusion? So reluctance to rule should be desired in a ruler if they are these true philosophers. They wouldn't really want to have anything to do with ruling people because they see beyond everything if they're philosophers. Yeah. And this reminded me of, I think I've talked about this before, but the Areopagitica, which was a speech by John Milton in the 1600s. Because England had imposed a rule that all books need to be cleared by the government. They need to be censored essentially. And one of the best arguments that I found from that was if we have these censors, then they must know what is right at all times. They must know what is correct, what is essentially the right thing to write about. What a waste of time for those people. If they have these skills, why would they be stuck in this position? Because that kind of leads us to believe that if there is somebody out there, they would not be in this position. Right. And then whoever is in this position is not doing the best job that they can do because they don't have all that knowledge. And that's essentially the same argument that he's making here. If the philosophers are, able to see beyond everything, why would they have any interest in doing this at all?
Right, and that's why our censors are always end up being blue-haired weirdos because they can't do anything else.
Yeah.
This is the only power I've ever had in my life. Silence, delete.
The other big issue with this society is that the utopia would be stagnant. Because
Yes.
everybody is doing what suits him, there will be no desire to do anything else. Everything is just purely calculated to do what is best according to this society. It would not be a fun society to live in. And then he brings up the idea, kind of what you mentioned earlier. Do the bronze-souled people only somewhat participate in justice because they have this limited understanding of the system? Do they even understand justice at all? So this brings up the worrying idea that moral capacity is class-related.
Correct.
If you're the working class, you don't know anything about morals. You have no say here, which is
Correct.
a terrifying thought to institute, formally in a society.
Well, I think they kind of had it de facto in those ancient societies where, the people who had all the wealth were considered morally superior. Like the king was divinely appointed and then everybody down after that.
Yeah, true. And then we get into this final conversation about decaying states, which I think is an interesting point here. I think it's better in some respects than a lot of the rest of the Republic.
Well, it's a little bit more practical, but it's like, well, why would it decay? If it's a perfect utopia where you have the best people in charge, why would they start making mistakes?
Yeah.
It seems that it's inconsistent with this theory.
Plato even says, one of the first things in this section is that Plato admits, even the utopia would decay. We have a cyclical nature of decay. And he says, first, honor would supersede wisdom as the basis of authority, which would give us a democracy. Everybody would start to value, what is honorable, what is, right, more than what is wise.
Right.
So that's when we get into this first stage, which is the democracy. The democracy will then degenerate into oligarchy, where the rich oppress the poor. So we'll have essentially two different states at that point. There will be the state of the rich and the state of the poor. And essentially when they fight each other enough, that'll bring about the inevitable revolution and the inevitable civil war, which will then bring democracy, where everyone does as he pleases. And then democracy then leads to the worst form of government, which is tyranny, where one person essentially takes control of all the other people. And then tyranny may begin the cycle again if the tyrant becomes a philosopher.
And he tried that a couple times and it didn't work out.
It didn't work out.
I'm going to teach this tyrant to be a philosopher.
Oh no, the tyrant's going to kill me.
Yeah. Although I do respect that he tried to see it through in real life.
Mm-hmm. That is true. So then he goes into this discussion about why democracy and tyranny are the worst. I'm going to read this section from the book. He says, democratic citizens are half crazy with a passion for novelties, never making up their minds what to do and never sticking with a decision, hence the disasters of the Peloponnesian War, and hence the imprudent overreaching that led to the war in the first place. The tyrant is Thrasymachus' hero, the man who can do whatever he likes because nobody can stop him. Plato paints a wonderful picture of the true horror of his situation. He can ascend to power only by murder and deception, and the maintenance of his rule depends upon exciting fear in his subjects. That means that he also excites hatred. He is, and knows he is, an enemy to the world, and the world is an enemy to him. He cannot have a moment's peace of mind, which I think is a good description of a tyrant. The tyrant is not happy himself, kind of going back to the idea that the just man would be happier than the tyrant, even if the tyrant has everything, because everybody hates the tyrant, and the tyrant hates everybody else, because he needs to keep his power.
Yeah, I think that's true to a point, but even like monarchies had extended families and supporters.
Yeah.
So you have to have some faction that is supporting you.
But I mean, even still,
even in a complete dictatorship, you can rule through fear to a certain point, but you could be a tyrant without continuous fear of assassination. I think.
Yeah, but I mean, even to an extent, like the people closest to the tyrant, especially, are probably there because they get the best benefits from the tyrant. I would argue, at least, like the advisors to the.
Well, if
to
they're
the
all
tyrant.
part of the same team, I mean, if it's like you're the team, I think this is a kind of a simplistic way to look at some of these tyrannical governments, because I think it's like Hitler had buddies.
Yeah.
There were attempts at his life, of course, but a lot of that was towards the end. Wasn't going so successful, but he had a lot of supporters at the beginning.
Yeah.
He's pretty horrible. Now, Stalin would be a better example because he ruled through murder and that, but he had supporters till the end too. But he would have. I don't know if he really cared, but I think those guys are exceptions to the normal monarch or tyrant or ruler in that type of top-down system, like the emperor. A couple of the Roman emperors lived for quite some time.
Yeah.
Died of natural causes and all that. So I mean, I don't know. If you have a system set up where you have at least some level of accountability or input from the public, like through a senate or some sort of group of aristocratic, nobles or whatever. I don't think you have to live in fear all the time. But you can't be an absolute ruler and obtain that position through too much murder, or else you're in that situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess that is a good point. Yeah,
not every tyrant lives in fear of his life all the time.
Yeah, true.
It depends on how you got there, really.
Yeah, that's fair.
And who's there with him.
Yeah. And so in the end, Plato still has not met Glaucon's challenge. He has not shown that a cool, calm, and collected tyrant would do worse than his victims. Essentially what you're saying.
Right.
Essentially, if there is a good tyrant out there, would he really be worse off than, just a just poor man?
Right.
Which, Plato essentially does not prove. But he is still persuasive on the worthlessness of the tyrant's life there, is what Alan Ryan says. He says, the Republic is ultimately not a picture of political life. There's no economy to regulate, no crime to suppress, no conflicting interests, no competing views on policy, and no conflicts of value. He says, I'm going to read the last couple sentences. From Aristotle onward, it has been recognized that Plato does not so much solve the problem of establishing a just polity as dissolve it. Plato's genius was in part to show so clearly how far our hankering after harmony, and how could he not hanker after harmony, is at odds with making everyday politics work more productively. Pursuing that point, Aristotle set out to show what sort of justice we might achieve in a non-utopian polity, and to him we now turn. He says, next chapter will be Aristotle, Politics is not Philosophy.
What are your thoughts?
I mean, I like a lot of what he says about justice up until we get to the justice is the overarching virtue of the three classes, essentially.
Right.
I like what he says about, justice isn't, just doing what's good for you. I think that's a great distinction to make, and especially would have been more controversial back in the ancient Greek times when, everybody's just out for themselves. And I think they are good arguments that he makes there against that idea particularly. But then once we get into the Republic, it's, it's a utopia. That's what it is. It's make believe. Yeah. Right. It'll never be achieved. And it's kind of interesting to think, did Plato really intend for it to really be achieved?
Right.
Because I mean, even he says even this utopia wouldn't work out eventually. It wouldn't last. So it's like, well, would he even want to institute that? Or is it more of a parable, describing the nature of our souls, essentially? I think that's really what it's getting at, is more metaphysical than practical public policy.
Yeah, more of a societal morality or societal judgment.
Yeah. But I do like
Gomorrah style.
Yeah, but I do like the point at the end that Alan Ryan makes, is that he doesn't really answer the question of what the perfect policy would be. Right. He essentially just destroys the question completely. He's like, correct. Well, we wouldn't even need the perfect policy if all these things existed. Right. And it's like, well, you didn't really answer the question, but you did present an interesting argument. I think at the end it's all very interesting, but
yeah, I don't find any of his stuff about how he would format the utopian society is interesting at all. It's just a bear to even look at and to read and to think about. It's like, God, this is just so stupid. And I know it's Plato, and I'm just a small town guy in Missouri, but my Lord, But I agree with you completely about the theories about justice. And I think that they were probably pretty groundbreaking at the time.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And they still resonate to this day,
I still think
in Christian thought.
A lot of his comments about rhetoricians, like I was saying earlier, can definitely be applied to a lot of politicians today.
Oh, absolutely.
Like I think that's still very on point, is that the politicians really aren't saying the truth. They're saying, what benefits them or their party at that given moment. And we should have more people in government who are actively seeking the truth and what is right. But whether or not that'll ever happen is a good question.
Yeah, and it's not just limited to politicians. It applies to all of us. When we're trying to convince somebody, including ourselves, of what should be done, sometimes we make the argument dishonestly just to convince the other person, sometimes ourselves, that this is the right thing to do. And I think that's true of lawyers. It's true of everybody. I mean, everybody makes an argument about what they're doing is the right thing to do. And it's, I forget who said it, but I really believe this is true, that we all have this tendency to believe that we're the hero in our own story. And it's hard to get past that and realize, oh man, I was the bad guy in that little experience.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to justify it by saying, essentially the arguments of Callicles is like,
Correct.
well, I just did what was in my power at that moment.
Correct.
That's what was correct for me at the time.
Right.
It's very
or
easy
you make
to
a
justify
dishonest argument, and it's very convincing.
Yeah.
You can make a convincing dishonest argument about a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And it's important to realize that's not the right thing to do. It's not just. It's not morally superior to make a moral argument based upon what is right and wrong and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, true. So I like a lot of what Plato wrote. I don't like the Republic at all.
Yeah.
It's horrible. It's horrible to read. He mentions it as an aside about these long soliloquies of Socrates going on about some subject in that book. It's like, oh my God! And then you kind of page ahead, and it's like three pages of one paragraph, or it depends on how they edit it. But it's like, God, like this guy's gonna keep talking about this stupid. I forget what I'm trying to think of an example of one of the little asides he had. It's like, man.
Yeah, I haven't read the Republic. I haven't read the only Plato that I've read so far. I want to read more. Is the Trial and Death of Socrates, and then the Credo and the Phaedo, the two dialogues immediately following his trial, which are both very good. I recommend reading those. But yeah, an interesting discussion, but whether or not it holds much ground in the politics world is a different question. But I think we'll see more of the practical politics moving on to Aristotle, because Aristotle even more heavily focused on the known sciences than
Correct.
Plato did, and
Right.
we talked about that the season 1 with Plato moving on to or Aristotle moving into the natural sciences and history and things like that. So I think it'll be a more practical discussion next week.
Truth.
Any other thoughts you want to share? Any other stories, rants?
No.
You want to talk about the firefighters?
No.
No. All right. You look like you were about to say something.
No, I'm going to keep it myself.
Okay, that's probably for the best.
If I'm reticent to share, you need to encourage that.
All right. You could follow us on Twitter at. We still need to think of a t-shirt competition, by the way. I'm not sure if we're 100% certain on the most interesting review or best review.
Yeah, don't you think?
You think so? Okay.
Yeah,
we can do that. We still have to design a t-shirt. But from
easy.
now until we design a t-shirt, leave us a review. The most interesting or the best review. Not the best as in terms of 5 stars. I guess I don't think we can really
It would be a platonic
bribe
ideal of the best review.
Yes, platonic
as
ideal of
determined by the two
yes,
of us.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Completely discretionary
Yes.
and without standards.
No, we'll ask Plato. We'll get him on.
You get a Ouija board out.
Yeah, we'll get him on the
Summon
podcast, and he'll tell us what the best review is. But leave us some interesting reviews. Let us know what you think.
Has anybody left a review recently?
Not that I know of.
Okay. All right.
But I haven't checked since last week.
We got to start looking at those.
We do.
We
Yeah.
gotta
If we're
encourage
having a
other people.
competition about it, we should probably look at
We
this.
should probably notice that there's.
Should we limit it to one platform on which they should review? Because you could review on any podcast platform.
I don't know. I don't know. I've never left a review, and
Because I'm trying to think the ones. I don't know if you can leave a written review on Spotify. I know you can leave stars, but I'm not sure. I'll need to look into it.
well, if they want to make sure that they
Apple
are eligible,
Podcasts, yes.
they have to tweet us that they've left a review.
Yes, you have to. Yes, absolutely. So once you've left a review, tweet at us at ULMTD Opinions on Twitter. That's ULMTD Opinions.
To make sure that we've seen the review, because
Yes.
we don't actually look at the review.
Yes,
but
yes.
we
You
will.
have to do all the work. We won't put any effort into this. You guys have to do this. All right, this has been Season 4, Episode 3 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
All right.
Now we're going to see some Booker T.
Time to see Booker T. Jones.
All right,
Exciting.
Mm-hmm.